The subject of this video is Passover and Jewish identity. And toward the end of the video, I'll focus upon what, in my mind, is a central passage of the Haggadah of Passover. The traditional Haggadah is a formalized text. It has its origins in the Talmudic period, but it's a formalized text that tells the story of the Exodus. The Exodus, you could say, is the first mass slave escape in recorded history, that our ancestors, Hebrews, were slaves in Egypt who escaped out of slavery and in the wilderness formed themselves into a people, Israel, the Jewish people, so that Passover is the celebration of the birth of the Jewish people. So the Haggadah then is in a formalized text that tells the story of the Exodus, the birth of the Jewish people, that we read on the first night of Passover in fulfillment of a biblical command from the book of Exodus, a biblical command to tell the story of the Exodus to our children. And the term Haggadah then means to tell. So that in reading the Haggadah on the first night of Passover, we're telling the story of the Exodus in fulfillment of the biblical command. So I want to begin by pointing out that Judaism is a religion in a very different sense than Christianity. Christianity is a religion in an orthodox sense. Orthodox, a Latin term meaning correct belief. Christianity is a religion in an orthodox sense of a faith commitment. Faith not just in God, but in Jesus as the Messiah or Savior. In principle, there can be no such thing as a secular, non-believing Christian. If you have a person who is born of Christian parents, and this person believes in God but doesn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah, this is not a true Christian. That in principle, there can be no such thing as a secular, non-believing Christian who doesn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Judaism, by contrast, if for some inexplicable reason we insist upon using Latin terms, traditional Judaism is a religion not in the sense of a faith commitment, but in an orthoprax sense. Orthoprax, correct practice, correct deeds. Judaism is a religion in an orthoprax sense of a way of life of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people is a people in the sense of a nation, in a nationalistic sense, not in a racial or an ethnic sense. From the very beginning of Jewish history, our blood has not been pure, and there have been Jews of differing racial and ethnic background. So in the biblical account, Joseph is given by Pharaoh, king of Egypt, an Egyptian woman, the daughter of an Egyptian priest, as his wife. And she is the mother then of Manasseh and Ephraim, the ancestors of two of the ancient tribes of Israel. Moses, prior to the Exodus from Egypt, Moses takes a Midianite woman as his wife, Zipporah. And then in the story of the Exodus, the Bible tells us that our ancestors, the Hebrews, were joined by what the Bible calls a mixed multitude, that in the plain meaning means people of differing racial and ethnic background who joined the Hebrews in escaping out of slavery from Egypt and forming themselves into the Jewish people. Moses, after the story of the Exodus, later in the biblical account, in the book of Numbers, the beginning of chapter 13, the Bible tells us that Moses took, in the plain meaning of the text, a second wife that the Bible describes as a Cushite woman, means a woman from the land of Cush. The land of Cush, we no longer know where that was, but it was some unknown area in Africa, which means that Moses took a dark black-skinned woman, in the plain meaning of the text, a dark black-skinned woman as his second wife. And by the way, the term Cushite in modern Hebrew is a derogatory term. That's not so in the Bible. In the Bible, it's not a derogatory term. It's simply a description a Cush of some land area in Africa. Today we no longer know where it was. So to go back then, Judaism is a religion in an orthoprax, correct deed sense of a way of life of the Jewish people. And what defines us as a people, as a nation, is not a faith commitment, and it's not a traditional life of law and ritual practice. What defines us as a people is being born of a Jewish mother or having converted. And what unites us as a people, as a nation, is not a faith commitment or a traditional life of law and ritual practice. What unites us as a people, a nation, is a shared history, a common language of the Jewish people, Hebrew, a national homeland, the land of Israel, and a shared culture or heritage. And I'm speaking of Judaism as a culture, something beyond a traditional life of law and ritual practice. So, for example, dietary laws are not only an expression of Jewish culture, but dietary laws are also a part of traditional Jewish law and ritual practice. By contrast, Israeli folk dancing is not a part of traditional Jewish law and ritual practice, but it is an expression of a larger Jewish culture, of our heritage. And indeed, many of the songs that are danced to in Israeli folk dancing, not all, but many, have their inspiration in the Jewish religious culture. It is many of the songs are songs taken from the Bible or from the prayer book, the traditional prayer book, or Sabbath songs, Shabbat songs. So that Israeli folk dancing then can be seen in some sense as drawing its inspiration from the Jewish religious culture. But it's an expression of Jewish culture. So now, in terms of Jewish identity, there are really two forms of Jewish identity: positive and negative. Positive, Jewish identity in a positive sense, is when a Jew identifies with his or her people and heritage and finds positive ways of expressing that Jewish identity. Just as I just mentioned, dietary laws as a part of traditional Jewish law and ritual practice is also an expression of Jewish identity, an expression of identity with the Jewish people and with the Jewish culture, Jewish heritage. Israeli folk dancing, even though not a part of traditional Jewish law and ritual practice, is an expression of Jewish identity, of identifying with the Jewish people and the Jewish culture and heritage. These are positive ways of expressing Jewish identity. Okay. Jewish identity in a negative sense is when others define us as a Jew. Jean-Paul Sartre, a great French philosopher, an existentialist philosopher, a humanist, Jean-Paul Sartre lived in the 20th century, wrote a tract on anti-Semitism, and he was opposed to anti-Semitism. And one of his famous statements is that a Jew is one who others define as a Jew. And I think then what Sartre was talking about was Jewish identity in this negative sense, that a Jew is one who others define as a Jew. It's not, I'm not defining myself as a Jew, it's others are defining me as a Jew. And actually, if we go back to the Bible, the first person in the Bible to define us as a people, as a nation, is actually Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 9. There, Pharaoh refers to the Hebrews as the people or nation. The word can be translated as people or nation, but he refers to the Hebrews as the people or nation of the children of Israel. And this is prior to the Exodus, prior to the Hebrews escaping out of slavery and forming themselves into the Jewish people in the wilderness, in defining themselves as Jews, as people Israel. Prior to the Hebrews defining themselves as a people, Pharaoh already defines them as a people. And so that Sartre, perhaps without awareness, is very faithful to the Bible in saying that a Jew is one who others define as a Jew, in speaking about Jewish identity in a negative sense. Sartre is very faithful to the biblical conception. And so that if we go back then to the Bible with the story of Pharaoh, defining the Hebrews as a people, notice that that's in the context of persecution and oppression of the Hebrews. This is really the beginnings of what we could say is Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, that our history as a people, a Jewish people, is a history of thousands of years of persecution and oppression, the worst persecution and oppression that the world has seen. And in terms of Jewish identity then, what unites most Jews is not, again, a faith commitment. It's not a traditional lifestyle of law and ritual practice. What unites us is even not in a positive sense. It's in this negative sense of identifying. What unites us more than anything else, most Jews, what unites us is in this negative sense, is identifying with our history of persecution and oppression. And so that's in terms of Jewish identity. Now to the Haggadah of Passover. The passage that I want to point to, that I said, which in my mind is a central passage, a high point of the Haggadah, is the passage of the four sons. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the wicked son. So the wicked son is the question that arises in relation to the wicked son in this passage of the Haggadah is what constitutes the wickedness of the wicked son. So there are many rabbis, teachers, Jews who give various explanations as to what constitutes the wickedness of the wicked son, and oftentimes these explanations that are given really are an elaboration beyond what's written in the Haggadah. That is, these explanations have no basis in the text itself, or even distort the text, bend it out of shape in order to fit prior preconceptions. And this in general is what I would consider to be, and I mean this as a constructive criticism, but it's really what I would call an intellectual disease that's rampant, especially in the Orthodox world, regarding texts in general, where texts are not read in a critical way to understand what the text is actually teaching, even though that's subjective, what the text is actually teaching. There's not an effort made to be faithful to the plain, what we call the plain meaning of the text, the plain, simple meaning of the text. And texts then are elaborated upon with adding things to the text that have no basis in the text, or where texts are distorted and bent out of shape to fit prior preconceptions. This is widespread throughout the Orthodox world. And in the Talmud, there's a famous statement, and in my mind a fundamental teaching of the Talmud, that it says, no verse ever loses its plain meaning. No verse ever loses its plain meaning. In its origins, it was referring to biblical verses, to interpreting the Bible. And what this teaching is saying then is it's actually giving legitimacy to elaborating upon biblical texts beyond what's written in the text. This is what we call in our tradition midrashic interpretation. Midrash was a method that the Talmudic rabbis used in a systematic way to learn halakha, Jewish law, and also agadah, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings of the Jewish tradition. Most of the teachings of the Jewish tradition, whether it's in the realm of halakha, law, or in the realm of agadah, moral, spiritual, philosophic teachings, most of the teachings of the Jewish tradition are midrash, which is an elaboration upon the text. It's not what the text itself is teaching. So that this saying then, no verse ever loses its plain meaning, is giving legitimacy to midrashic interpretation. But what it's saying is that first and foremost, before we elaborate upon a text, First and foremost, we need to understand what the text itself is teaching. Okay, so if we go back to the Haggadah of Passover regarding the wicked son, the text in this case tells us explicitly what is the wickedness of the wicked son. And what the text says is that, I'll read it in Hebrew and translate. It says that the wicked son says, Ma avodah hazot lechem. What is this service to you? Service here means the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder means arrangement. Is on the first night of Passover, we have what's called a Seder, an arrangement where we're eating a festive meal and telling the story of the Exodus, that we read again the Haggadah in fulfillment of this command to tell the story of the Exodus. So the wicked son says, what is this service to you? And then the Haggadah continues and says, to you and not to him. And it says, Lefi she'hotzi et atzmo min haklal, as he has excluded himself from the klal. And klal here means principle. He's excluded himself from the principle. What does that mean, the principle? It's clearly the principle of belonging to the Jewish people. And remember that the belonging to the Jewish people is a fundamental principle of Judaism as a religion. Judaism has these two basic elements that I delineated. It's a way of life of a people, of a nation, so that the notion of belonging to a people in Judaism is a religious principle, a fundamental religious principle, an integral part of Judaism as a religion. And this is, so then what the Haggadah says is, what is, the Haggadah says that the wicked son asks, what is this service to you? To you and not to him, as he excludes himself from the fundamental principle of belonging to the Jewish people. This is his wickedness, is he has no feeling of Jewish identity. He excludes himself from the Jewish people. This is his wickedness. And then the Haggadah continues and adds something else here. I won't read the whole passage, but what the following statement is that kafar be'ikar in Hebrew means that he denied a fundamental principle. Ikar is another word for principle besides the word klal. And it says he denies a fundamental principle. And the word kafar there is a Talmudic term for heresy. So that not only is the wicked son then described here as wicked, but the Haggadah describes him as a heretic. And the question that arises now is, what is the heresy of the wicked son? And the heresy, the term heresy, if we go back to the Bible, as far as I am aware, there is no term heresy in the Bible. The Bible, and certainly no notion of theological heresy. Remember that the Bible is entirely absent of theological analysis, theological philosophic analysis and argument. There is no theological dogma, set of beliefs, theological beliefs that one must accept that the Bible formulates or codifies. No dogma whatsoever in the Bible. The Bible in its nature is orthoprax, correct deeds, not orthodox, correct belief. The Bible, the religious concern of the Bible is not an orthodox concern with correct belief, faith. The religious concern of the Bible is an orthoprax concern with moral character and moral action. The essence of religion in the biblical conception, if I were to choose one verse that captures the essence of biblical religion, or the biblical conception of religion, is the verse in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 18, you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. That it's an orthoprax emphasis on doing, not believing. You shall do that which is right and good. And the emphasis is on morality, not ritual, not law. Do that which is right and good. Right, the word right there means righteous and good. The previous verse, right before that, talks about observance of commandments in a legal sense and in terms of ritual. And then it says, and you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. Moral character, moral action. An orthoprax conception of religion. So that the Bible doesn't formulate any theological dogma, and there is no word for, certainly not theological heresy in the Bible, but there's no word for heresy at all, as far as I'm aware. In the Talmudic literature, the concept of heresy is not theological, it's behavioral. The concept does exist, as here in the Haggadah with this word kofer or kfirah, which means to deny. But it's a behavioral concept. And also there's another concept of, or another term that's used for heresy in the Talmudic literature, apikoros, which is evidently a Greek or Aramaic term. We don't know exactly what the literal meaning is, but apikoros, according to the Talmudic definition, is a behavioral concept, not a theological concept. What it means according to the Talmud, apikoros, is someone who is scornful of the Jewish tradition of Torah in the sense of Judaism as a way of life. So that the apikoros is one who is scornful of Jewish tradition, of Torah, of Judaism as a way of life. That's behavioral. So that heresy in the Talmud is a behavioral concept that's referring to deviant behavior. Not all deviant behavior is heresy. When does deviant behavior become heresy? When it's the result of scorn, derision toward the Jewish tradition, toward Judaism. That's what constitutes heresy in the Talmud. There is no notion of theological heresy because the Talmudic rabbis did not codify any theological dogma, the same as in the Bible doesn't codify a theological dogma. The Talmudic rabbis faithful to the Bible did not codify a theological dogma, and the Jewish law and the Talmudic tradition is orthoprax, correct deeds in nature, that the Jewish law is based on the commandments, mitzvot, of the 5 books of Moses. That's a kind of legal constitution of the Jewish people, and the commandments according to the Talmudic tradition are commandments, mitzvot, of doing, action, orthoprax, correct deeds. Commandments of doing, literally in Hebrew, mitzvot aseh and lo ta'aseh, literally commandments of doing and not doing. So there's no theological dogma in the Talmud and no notion of theological heresy. The first to codify a formal binding theological dogma in Judaism, the first and only figure to codify a binding theological dogma from a legal point of view was Maimonides, the great legal scholar and philosopher who lived in the 12th century, in the Middle Ages. And Maimonides formulated what are called his 13 principles of faith as a binding dogma. And in my view, Maimonides was very aware that this is a distortion of the orthoprax nature of Judaism. And Maimonides formulated and codified his dogma only as a political leader, not as a thinker, as a political leader for the unlearned Jewish masses, to strengthen them as Christians and Muslims had formulated and codified dogmas. So, but in Maimonides' codification of a formal dogma, this is actually the first time in Jewish history that an orthodox conception of Judaism has been created, of an orthodox correct belief conception of Judaism. I think it's a widespread misconception that Judaism has always been orthodox and that authentic Judaism is orthodox. Authentic Judaism based on the Talmud and the Bible is orthoprax and not orthodox. And orthodox was a later historical development in the Middle Ages, beginning with Maimonides' codification of a formal dogma. This is the first time in Jewish history in which a Christian conception of in which an orthodox, which is really a Christian conception of Judaism, is created in the formulating and codifying by Maimonides of his dogma. And also then represents the first time in Jewish history when a theological and again a Christian orthodox conception of heresy is created, the first time that a theological conception of heresy is created. And this is a distortion of our ancient heritage based on the Bible and the Talmud, which is orthoprax in nature. So that the concept of heresy, again in the Talmud, is a behavioral concept that's deviant behavior, that's the result of scorn, derision toward the Jewish tradition and Judaism. So if we go back then to the Haggadah of Passover, the wicked son, the Haggadah tells us exactly what his wickedness is about. It's not because of a lack of proper theological belief. It's not because he's not observant of traditional law and ritual practice. His wickedness is that he has no sense of Jewish identity, no feeling of Jewish identity. And he excludes himself from the Jewish people, which is deviant behavior, the result of scorn. He's scornful of his tradition. What is this service to you, not to him? He excludes himself. That act is an act of scorn. That constitutes his heresy in the continuation of the Haggadah. And it has nothing to do with his theology again, nothing to do with whether he lives an observant lifestyle of Jewish law or ritual practice. His heresy is behavioral and excluding himself from the Jewish people. And that's what we're celebrating on Passover, is the birth of the Jewish people, the exodus from Egypt. And we're on Passover then expressing our Jewish identity, our identification with the Jewish people and with our heritage and culture.